The Arizona Society Sons of the American Revolution presents The Old North Church, The Untold Story, narrated by George White, Barry M. Goldwater Chapter. This is Volume 1 of a 3-part miniseries. By now we all know the children's poem of Paul Revere's Ride, but how much do you really know about the Old North Church? Did you know that the Old North of today was called the Christ Church in 1775? Did you know that during that time there was another church in Boston called the Old North Church? So what happened to the original Old North, and why the name change of the Christ Church? Let's start with the original Old North Church. In 1630, Puritan colonists founded the town of Boston and built the first church in what we now know as the South End. By the late 1640s, the first church was still the only church in Boston, and it was at capacity. So a second church was built in the north end of town to handle the overflow of people. The first two churches in Boston were referred to as the South or First Church, and the North or the Second Church. The second church was constructed in 1650, and for 65 years it was the only church in the north end of Boston. It was built in what used to be called Clark Square, and today more commonly known as the North Square. By 1714, there was a split in the North Church, again at capacity, so some members broke off and built a new church nearby and called it the New North Church. From then on, the church in the square was referred to as the Old North Church. As can be seen in the 1722 map of Boston, the Old North Church being shown as location B and the New North Church shown in location H. Reverend John Lathrop was the minister of the Old North Church before and up to the time of the British forces occupying Boston. He was the 7th minister of this church. On March 5, 1770, what we now know as the Boston Massacre, 5 men were shot and killed on King Street by British soldiers. James Caldwell was one of the dead. He was shot in the back twice. James attended this church, and after his death, Paul Revere and others were very outspoken about the shooting. Reverend John Lathrop was one of the outspoken people, and 6 days later, from this church, Reverend Lathrop delivered a sermon called Innocent Blood Crying to God from the Streets of Boston. On October 11, 1773, Paul Revere was married to his second wife, Rachel Walker, in this church, with Reverend John Lathrop performing the ceremony. The Revere home was only 130 feet away on the other side of the square, which then was called the Clark Square. The British referred to Reverend Lathrop and the church as the Nest of Traitors, and after the events of April 1775, Reverend Lathrop and his family were exiled from Boston until the British left in March of the following year. Luckily, Reverend Lathrop took the church records with him when he left Boston. On December 14, 1775, General William Howe ordered his troops to destroy the Old North Church. They started with the tower and upon taking it down used it for firewood. While they also damaged some of the other churches they considered to be attended by traitors, the Old North was the only one in Boston that was ordered to be destroyed. When the British left Boston on March 17th, they set fire to what was left of the Old North, ultimately destroying it. The church was 125 years old. Upon returning to Boston, Reverend John Lathrop and his congregation found the remains of the Old North. They cleared the land where the Old North stood and built the new parsonage house for Reverend Lathrop on the site, as can be seen in this 1798 map of property owners. The remaining congregation joined the New Brick Church congregation, and eventually Reverend Lathrop would lead the services. Paul Revere also attended this church. As a child, he was christened there, and as an adult served on the standing committee. His funeral services were also attended at the new brick church. The new brick church was constructed in 1721, neighboring Paul Revere's home. The large bell that had been cast by Paul Revere was removed from the Old North Church from the remains and hung in the tower of the new brick church because it was the larger of the two bells. Now let's look at the Christ Church. It was constructed in 1723 on Salem Street. In 1723, there were already 11 other churches in Boston, and many of them in the North End. Reverend Mather Byles, Jr. resided over the Christ Church before and up to the time of the siege. He was known to be a loyalist of the king and considered to be a Tory preacher with members of the British forces in his congregation. He resigned his position with the church and accepted a post as chaplain to the royal regiments. When General Howe left Boston in 1776, Reverend Mather Byles Jr. and his family left with the British and went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, as can be recognized on the plaque. This memoriam to Reverend Byles can be seen on the Christ Church. So how and why did the Christ Church become known as the Old North? It all began around the time of America's centennial celebration. In 1876, Philadelphia was hosting the first World's Fair for the centennial. Recall the Declaration of Independence was first drafted and debated and eventually signed in Philadelphia. New York had its own big celebrations planned with parades and events. Recall the Bill of Rights were drafted in New York. Boston, too, had some history in the Revolution. The Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, the Old North Church, just to name a few. By the time of the centennial celebration, however, most of the locations were no longer the same or the buildings were gone. The Green Dragon Tavern was the meeting place of the Sons of Liberty. By 1857, it had been demolished in a fire. The Liberty Tree, that was the location of many speeches, was chopped down and used for firewood by the British in 1775. The Boston Tea Party. Griffin's Wharf was the site of the Boston Tea Party. The area had been backfilled in the 1800s to expand the landmass, and the wharf was removed. There remains a plaque today to mark the site. And of course, the Old North Church was destroyed during the invasion of Boston. By 1876, most people didn't know about the Old North, other than the popular poem that was written 15 years earlier. One theory for the name change was the poem written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It first appeared in the Atlantic Monthly magazine in January of 1861 to generate patriotism for the beginning of the Civil War. It was very loosely based on the events that happened, with many parts of the story written incorrectly. The poem had become very popular, however, and by the end of the Civil War, Longfellow's poem was published with other short stories in a book called Tales of a Wayside Inn in January of 1864. In 1876, the oldest church still standing in the north end of Boston was the Christ Church. Longfellow would not have known of the demise of the Old North Church, so the Christ Church would have been assumed to be the Old North. It is likely the city council assumed it was the original church. The city council had created a plaque for the centennial to be placed on the Christ Church, recognizing it as the location where the signal lanterns were hung. Some local historians spoke up to point out the error, and the debate of the signal lanterns had begun. As mentioned by local historian Richard Frothingham in his book, The Memorial History of Boston, the Reverend Dr. Eaton of the Christ Church had published a book in 1823 called A Historical Discourse of the Christ Church. This book is the documentation of the Christ Church, and its history right down to how thick the walls are. There is no mention of the signal lanterns, of Paul Revere, or of William Dawes, or of April 1775, other than noting that Reverend Mather Byles has resigned his charge, for what reason does not appear. For 2 years there was debate over the City Council's decision, with a lot of circumstantial evidence being used to support the decision, like the church being the tallest and the oldest church in the north end of Boston, therefore it must be the Old North Church. Other arguments were because the other churches were built by Puritans, they weren't really churches. Ultimately, the plaque was hung on the Christ Church in 1878. Here's the order of events. In 1650, the second church, or North Church, is constructed in the square. In 1714, the new North Church is constructed on North Street. From then on, the second church becomes known as the Old North Church. In 1723, the Christ Church is constructed on Salem Street. In 1775, the British invade the town of Boston. Later that year, the Old North Church is destroyed. In 1823, a historical account of the Christ Church is published for its 100th anniversary. There is no mention of the lanterns or Paul Revere. In 1861, Longfellow publishes a poem of Paul Revere's ride. In 1864, it is published again in a book called Tales of a Wayside Inn that becomes a very popular book. In 1873, a historic account of the Christ Church is published for the 150th anniversary. Only now it mentions the lanterns of Paul Revere, except they got the story wrong, and the only source of the information was the son of the person who allegedly hung the lanterns. Afterwards, many stories pop up connecting longtime residents of their family member to the Christ Church or the Paul Revere story during the Revolution. In 1876, the Boston City Council wants to hang a plaque on the Christ Church calling it the Old North. That year, local historians argued the real Old North was destroyed, so a commission was created to decide. The commission uses circumstantial evidence and hearsay to make the decision, and the plaque is hung on the Christ Church. There are many maps of Boston that predate the decision of the Boston City Council of 1876. The Christ Church is never called or labeled the Old North Church on any of these maps. In part 2 of this mini-series, we will take a closer look at all of the maps. The same can be said of many books and diaries that were written predating 1876. In part 3 of this mini-series, we will take a closer look at the books. This presentation was brought to you by the Arizona Society, Sons of the American Revolution. Thank you for watching.